The air in Dar es Salaam carried the scent of sea salt and diesel as ships lined the harbor, offloading containers stamped with the tricolor of India. Inside those containers were machines, fertilizers, and parts destined for the rolling farmlands of Morogoro and Iringa, symbols of a new kind of partnership, one built not on extraction, but on exchange. It was not the first time India and Tanzania had traded, but it was the first time the exchange promised a shared transformation rather than one-sided dependence. It began quietly, without fanfare, in the late 2020s. The global north was still reeling from economic contraction and climate backlash. Sanctions and protectionism had become the new language of diplomacy. Amid this shifting terrain, a new bloc of nations, those once labeled developing, began to look inward and sideways to one another. India, with its swelling tech sector and agri-tech innovations, turned to Africa not merely for resources, but for partnership. Tanzania, steady and stable, with its fertile land and youthful population, saw in India a mirror of its own journey, colonized, resilient, and now rising. The first major agreement between the two nations came under what was called the Green Crescent Initiative. It was an ambitious agricultural development framework that sought to marry Indian innovation with Tanzanian potential. Indian firms provided solar irrigation systems, low-cost drones for crop surveillance, and data-driven weather prediction tools. In return, Tanzania opened its fertile fields to joint ventures, ensuring local ownership and knowledge transfer. The slogan that circulated through both governments' media arms captured the spirit: two sons, one harvest. At the heart of the initiative was a young Tanzanian agronomist named Asha Mwakyembe. Educated in Dodoma and later at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Delhi, she embodied the new generation of Pan-African thinkers, rooted in the soil, but global in outlook. Her team's pilot project in Colosa became the testing ground for smart agriculture, using Indian-developed algorithms that analyzed soil composition through mobile apps. Farmers who had long relied on ancestral wisdom now found themselves decoding satellite data on their phones. Asha often recalled her grandfather's words: "We used to wait for the rains to decide our fate. Now, we decide when to make the rains work for us." It was not an abandonment of tradition, but a fusion, just as Pan-Africanism had always envisioned. The liberation of African economies, Asha believed, would come not through slogans, but through self-determined cooperation. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs watched closely. The partnership with Tanzania was more than an agricultural experiment. It was a strategic statement. For decades, India's foreign policy toward Africa had oscillated between aid and trade, but now it evolved into mutual industrialization. The Indo-Tanzanian Pact became the model of equitable globalization, a concept gaining traction among nations disillusioned by Western financial institutions. The South-South Economic Corridor, once a distant dream of the Banding Conference generation, was quietly being revived, digitally, agriculturally, and ideologically. In Morogoro, the transformation was tangible. Cooperatives that had once struggled to secure fertilizer imports through European middlemen now procured them directly from Indian state cooperatives under fair pricing models. Smallholder farmers pooled resources to form Umoja Agrotech, a cooperative backed by both Indian microfinance institutions and Tanzanian banks. Its members shared profits, reinvested in equipment, and, for the first time, exported processed goods rather than raw produce. Cassava flour, branded under the name Nguva Mix, reached Indian supermarkets in Mumbai and Bengaluru, competing alongside imported wheat products. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Africa was no longer exporting raw potential. It was exporting finished excellence. Yet, such progress was not without its skeptics. Critics in both nations warned of dependency in new forms. Some Tanzanian economists questioned whether the influx of Indian technology would sideline local innovation. Others in India worried that the government's investments in Africa might stretch domestic resources too thin. But both governments held firm. The Tanzanian president, a former trade unionist named Zawadi Lahanga, articulated the partnership's vision before the African Union. Pan-Africanism does not mean turning away from our friends in the South. It means building solidarity where exploitation once stood. India understands our past because it fought its own. Together, we are rewriting the global economy from the ground up, literally, from the farm. Her speech reverberated across the continent. Other nations, Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, and Rwanda, soon sought similar frameworks with India. A quiet movement was forming, not imposed by superpowers but seeded through shared ambition. Behind the grand policies and headlines were the lives being changed in subtle, profound ways. In the dusty village of Kilombero, 63-year-old farmer Mzee Hamasai had never seen a computer before 2031. By 2035, his sons were operating drone cameras to monitor maize fields. Their yields had tripled, not because of foreign grants, but because of knowledge shared through peer networks funded by Indo-Tanzanian research centers. They no longer feared drought, they planned for it. India, too, was evolving from the exchange. A new generation of Indian entrepreneurs saw Africa not as a market to exploit, but as a partner to grow with. The Mumbai-based firm Agrasutra set up a research branch in Dodoma, employing both Indian and Tanzanian engineers. They worked side by side on climate-resilient crop varieties. Asha, now heading Tanzania's Agricultural Innovation Council, often visited these labs. She noticed how, despite their different languages and backgrounds, the teams communicated effortlessly through data, design, and purpose. It wasn't only about farming. Infrastructure followed the flow of trade. Indian-built rail networks began connecting Tanzania's interior regions to its ports. Solar microgrids, funded jointly by Indian startups and Tanzanian cooperatives, powered villages that had never known electricity. Women, long sidelined in agrarian economies, took center stage as operators, engineers, and financiers. The Pan-African Women's Development Fund, inspired by India's self-help group model, became a continental force. By the mid-2030s, the Indo-Tanzanian partnership had transcended agriculture. Biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and digital finance joined the mix. Tanzanian-grown morina became a staple ingredient in Indian nutraceuticals. Meanwhile, Indian-made generic medicines reached remote African clinics through blockchain-tracked supply chains, eliminating counterfeit drugs. Asha's story became the subject of documentaries and summits, but she insisted her success was collective. "What we are building," she said at a Delhi conference, "is not aid. It is agency." Still, the world outside was not idle. Western multinationals, alarmed by the success of South-South trade, began lobbying for stricter trade regulations in global institutions. There were attempts to reframe the partnerships as strategic dependencies, but the Global South had found its voice. At the 2040 BRICS Plus Summit, Tanzania co-authored a declaration with India calling for a new banding framework, a digital age revival of the 1955 spirit. It emphasized fair technology exchange, sovereign data ownership, and environmental justice. Trade must not only be free, President Lahanga declared. It must be fair, and it must be ours. As the world shifted toward regional blocs, the Indo-Tanzanian model became a case study in resilience. When global supply chains faltered during climate crises in the late 2030s, the Green Crescent nations sustained food stability across Africa and Asia. Their community seed banks, satellite-linked forecasting systems, and local processing plants insulated them from famine. For the first time in modern history, African nations exported not just hope, but food security. The partnership's impact rippled into cultural spheres as well. Tanzanian music found new audiences in Indian streaming platforms. Indian cinema incorporated African narratives of resistance and renewal. Universities launched joint degree programs, and a new generation of thinkers emerged, economists, agronomists, artists, who spoke of the Afro-Indian century as a lived reality, not an aspiration. One of those thinkers, Indian historian Dr. Rakesh Menon, wrote, "The colonial map divided us by oceans, but our destinies were always intertwined by soil. The monsoon that feeds India also carries the spirit of Africa." By the 2050s, the partnership had matured into something larger, a federation of economic ecosystems. The Pan-South Prosperity Network, headquartered in Dodoma, oversaw trade across more than 30 countries. Its operating principles were simple: reciprocity, sustainability, and shared innovation. Unlike the World Bank or IMF, it had no conditional loans, no austerity clauses. Its funding came from shared dividends of member enterprises, including those birthed in the India-Tanzania alliance. Asha, now in her 50s, often visited the original Colosa farm where it all began. The once barren land now hosted a learning center for agro-entrepreneurs from across the global south. She walked among the crops, remembering the early days of skepticism. Her assistants addressed her as director, but she still preferred to be called mwalimu, teacher. Development, she would say to young visitors, is not when we produce more, but when we depend less. Across the Indian Ocean, Indian farmers were also transforming. The lessons learned from Tanzanian soil management, organic fertilizers, cooperative irrigation, decentralized energy, were now being applied in drought-prone Indian regions like Marathwada and Bundelkhand. The circle of exchange had completed itself. Tanzanian innovation informed Indian resilience. Indian technology empowered African sovereignty. This was not charity. It was evolution. As geopolitics grew more polarized, the Indo-Tanzanian story offered an alternative path. When superpowers competed over data colonies and rare earth dominance, India and Tanzania advocated for a commons-based approach. Their joint motion at the United Nations for technology as a shared heritage of humanity passed with overwhelming support from global South nations. The world was beginning to listen. The phrase "from farm to fortune" became not just a slogan, but a philosophy. It symbolized the journey from subsistence to self-determination. It echoed the spirit of Nehru's Ujamaa and Gandhi's Swaraj, community-centered progress through cooperation. The two nations, once subjects of empire, now stood as architects of a new order. In the twilight of her career, Asha traveled to India one last time, visiting the rural cooperative in Maharashtra that had adapted Tanzanian agroforestry models. She stood before the farmers, their faces sunlit and hopeful. "When we began," she told them, "people said Africa and India were too different, too far apart. But the soil teaches us otherwise. It asks for care, not conquest. And care is a universal language." The crowd applauded softly, and she smiled, thinking of her grandfather's fields back home. Somewhere across the ocean, Indian engineers were tuning solar panels made in Dar es Salaam. Tanzanian youth were coding new weather apps using Bengaluru servers. The currents of history had turned. By the dawn of the 2060s, the phrase South-South had lost its geographic connotation. It became an ethic, a way of building, trading, and living rooted in dignity. From the rice paddies of Kerala to the cassava fields of Morogoro, the hum of shared prosperity filled the air. The story of India and Tanzania was no longer a bilateral one. It was continental, planetary even. And in the quiet of an early Tanzanian morning, as the sun rose over golden fields nourished by shared knowledge and mutual respect, Asha whispered the words that had guided her all her life. "We have learned that the future is not to be found in someone else's blueprint. It grows, like our crops, from the soil we tend together." The partnership between India and Tanzania had begun in the dirt, but it had rewritten destiny. From farm to fortune, from cooperation to transformation, the South had not merely risen. It had bloomed.